Welcome to the 14th session of our Food for Thought lecture series. Today we're honored to have Joe Pfeiffer, who is the Director for Crisis Leadership at the National Center for Disaster Preparedness and the Founding Director of FDNY's Center for Terrorism and Disaster Preparedness. Today's session is going to be focused on leadership for a pandemic, and we're glad to have all of you. Just a quick run through of how we do things. If you have a question, please save it for the discussion sections. I think we might do smaller discussion sections rather than a Q&A, a big Q&A at the end. So just keep an eye out for that. If you'd like to get on video and ask your question virtually, but in person, you can do so. Just raise your hand and I'll call on you. And if you just want to put your question in the chat, we can read it out for you. And now I'll hand it off to Joe.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's great to see everybody. Since we have a small group, I hope we could have a discussion and really wrestle with what we're going through now, the pandemic, but we'll also talk about past events and how those past events can give us a clue on what we should be doing in our present crisis. So I'm going to show you my screen. It has a little PowerPoint. Don't worry, it's only 4 slides. I won't kill you with the PowerPoint, but just to bring us into this. I'm sorry, that's not what I wanted.
Oh, also, just one last thing. If you're not asking a question, just please put yourself on mute so you can minimize outside noise. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I think we have it now. As we look at really these two pictures, it brings up all sorts of memory. Going back 19 years, and actually in 2 days from now, it'll be the 19th anniversary of 9/11. Seems almost like ancient history, 19 years ago. But at the same time, we're going through an incredible crisis now, where in the United States alone, we have lost over 190,000 people. On 9/11, we lost almost 3,000, and we thought that was unbelievable and hard to comprehend. But I think with the pandemic, it's just as difficult to comprehend, even though the disaster is far worse. But let me bring you back to that day a little bit. And as some of you know from being in my class, is that at 8:46 on 9/11, a beautiful summer day, we heard the roar of jet engines coming overhead. And you never hear jet engines in Manhattan because of tall buildings. And I saw the first plane, American Airliners, to aim and crash into the World Trade Center. And in that moment, I knew I was going to the largest fire of my life. And I was the guy that had to be in command, at least initially. But what I also noticed was that every firefighter, every police officer, every paramedic, every first responder that came that day, they looked at the burning buildings and they also looked into their heart. And even though this was our job to run in, I can tell you that everyone that ran into danger that day made a personal decision. They made a personal decision to go in. And I think we see the same thing with our healthcare workers. They know it's dangerous going into into the ED, to the emergency department, into intensive care units, and they make a personal decision to go in. And we can't overlook that. It is personal, it's dangerous, and people are worried. But not only are they worried, as you look at this event, and I did some surveys on some past classes on, and I asked people, when we think of the coronavirus, what word comes to your mind? And I ask you just to think about that. What's the first word that comes to your mind? And a lot of people use the word fear. I'm afraid. I don't know what the future will hold, the uncertainty. And I think that's universal. And it's an opportunity for us, for other leaders, for crisis leaders, to look at what principles we hold during these crises. And what I would argue, or what I would say from my past experience, not only 9/11, but Hurricane Sandy, and actually the Ebola crisis, and many, many other events that I've been at, I think there's 5 things that crisis leaders do, and the principles that I've seen throughout the world. I've looked at and examined many different terrorist attacks. I've been back and forth to Paris a whole bunch of times after the attacks on Paris in 2015, the terrorist attacks, and I have spoken to people from the UN and in Geneva about their experiences. And it seems to be 5 things that are common, 5 principles that we hold to, no matter where we are in the world. And we were just talking a little bit before we start about my experience in China and teaching at Tsinghua University. And the same thing holds true with an international group, no matter where they are. And that's that we connect, collaborate, coordinate, and some sort of command and control. Those 5 principles seems to hold true. That connecting is about hastily forming networks of communicating to people, but setting the networks in motion. The next is to collaborate, which is really just exchanging ideas. People talking to each other, and we'll talk a little bit about how difficult that is when people are under stress. And then the ability to align efforts together. And then there's this command and control, and we think that as very lineal, that there's one person in charge, but it's really not. It's more than one person. It's more of a network, and we'll talk about that. But what I like to do is pop out of this PowerPoint slide and let's have a conversation on each of these things, and we'll break it up into 4 areas: the connect, collaborate, coordinate, and then the command and control. And let's just have a conversation. So let me stop my slide here. And we'll talk a little bit about connecting. I think the leaders that are great connectors are the ones that can make a difference. And we connect by voice, video, and data. So on 9/11, if you were watching the news broadcast, you had more information than I did. More information than I did standing in the lobby of the North Tower. You saw a video that I didn't. So in a world that we're very visual, not only do we want to talk to each other, but we want to see each other. So I think everybody has done Zoom to the nth degree, but is there a difference between a conversation, can you hear me now, on a phone and video conferencing? So do we feel that there's a difference between the two now that we've done both extensively? So in other words, is it better for leaders to see each other like we're looking at each other now, or just do a quick phone call, a conference call, that is? Well, you think there's a difference?
Can I jump in?
Sure.
I would say, the nonverbal cues are really important to understand the tone of people's words. I think over the phone you get that just by their voice, but it gives it another dimension. And I would say as well that engagement over the phone, also tone, but it gives you a better view of things when people are focused on your image on screen. They're not on their phone. You can see those cues right away. That's what I would say. Difference.
Exactly. Those cues are important. Plus, it becomes personal. You know, we don't know each other, but if we see each other's face, that relationship starts to build. So I think that's important. The other thing, especially in the COVID world, data. Data becomes so important. Tracking of people who contacted the virus. The data of hospital beds, that becomes critical. And we could go on and on with those data sets. But if we are to manage a pandemic without data, I'm flying blind. I really don't know how to anticipate the future. The other thing, and I'll go back to video for a second, and think about it in New York in that March and April time frame when it was when New York was peaking. I remember looking at a news broadcast, and maybe you had the same experience of seeing Times Square empty, virtually empty, or the restaurants empty. I think that was telling people was not to go into the city. It was giving people permission, because I didn't see the restaurants crowded or Times Square crowded. We were given nonverbal communications just by the video and giving people permission. Okay, you don't have to go into the city. Be like your peers. And I think that's one of those things that we see with the whole thing with masks and people wearing it and not wearing it. It's really giving other people permission to wear the mask, because none of us want to be all by ourselves, especially in a crisis. So the more we see our peers not being at a restaurant or wearing a mask, the more we feel like part of that group. I could do the same thing now, walk in the street and pull out my mask as I go past people. The other part of connecting is what I would term as crisis empathy. And that's the ability to recognize other people's feelings and to articulate it. So, something what we did a little earlier, by saying to the public, I understand that you're afraid and not sure where you're going to get that paycheck from, and worried about your kids going to school and bringing it home to your parents. I think that crisis empathy is critical when we talk to the public. Before we tell them what we want to do, we have to recognize where they're at and to articulate it. And now I could say, and what we're doing now in New York City or New York State or wherever we may be, Now, this is what we're doing, and this is how we want to mitigate the incident. So I think it's that combination. So let me just stop for a second and see if there's any questions on coordinating, connecting. Okay, and we'll have time later on as well. The next thing, what we do is collaborate. We talk to each other and exchange ideas. But in a crisis, something happens. Not only are we have this cocktail of stress hormones going through our brain. You know, the adrenaline and to flight or fight. Do I want to run and get out of here, or do I want to fight? And a whole bunch of other cocktails of stress hormones. But I want to point out one that's really, really interesting. And that's the one of oxytocin. Oxytocin gets the popular name of being the cuddle hormone, or cuddle, but it's really about being close to each other. In the crisis, we don't want to be alone. I want to be with somebody else. And we usually gravitate to our own groups. And we saw it on 9/11. Firefighters went to firefighters, cops went to cops. And we see that happening here in the pandemic. Different parts of government, different parts of the hospital system gravitating to themselves. And I would term this as organizational bias. Groups turning into their own groups and excluding the outer group. On 9/11, we had police helicopters circling the World Trade Center after the first collapse, after the South Tower collapsed. And I was in the North Tower not knowing that a whole building collapsed. And those police helicopters gave messages that the top 15 floors of the North Tower that I was in was glowing red, that the corner of the building is starting to buckle. Pull everybody back. It's not going to take much longer. And those messages never got to the fire department. And the fire department never asked. Here at the most crucial time where everybody wanted to do the right thing, we turned into ourselves. And I wonder if we see the same thing happening in the COVID world. I know initially hospitals were so stressed, they turned into themselves. And Elmhurst Hospital, for one, was overcrowded. It was really at the epicenter in New York. And they didn't realize that adjoining hospitals not too far away had beds opened. So I think as we talk about collaborating, it's harder than we normally would think. Let me just pause a second and we'll move to the next one. If there's questions, we'll stay where we are.
I had a question about that Elmhurst. And what's the name of the other hospital?
Oh, we could go on and on with different hospitals. Elmhurst, New York Presbyterian in Manhattan, and then there's other hospitals that were part of the network that had more beds.
So with that, are those all private or public, or was there a distinction between those hospitals that played into that miscommunication?
Yeah, that's a great point. Because within New York City, we have a little over 60 hospitals, and some of them are public hospitals, and some are private. There are huge networks within the private sector. And initially, with the stress level, we're turning into our own hospital, our own network, public or private. And it takes some organization, which we'll talk about next, on how to coordinate that. But if we don't connect and we don't talk to each other and collaborate, there is no way we're going to be able to coordinate. It's only by doing the first two, it sets the conditions to be able to coordinate across different hospital systems. So coordination is first looking at to be able to connect for information to the public, to different networks, and then being able to talk to each other. That sets the conditions that now we may be able to coordinate resources. One hospital has resources that another doesn't. And we talked about ventilators, especially in the beginning. We ran out of ventilators in New York City, and Governor Cuomo had to reach out to other states to get it. But you need to know what state to reach out to ahead of time. So is the ability to start to coordinate resources, hospital resources like ventilators, PPE. We didn't have that. I know my wife and daughter's a nurse, and they had to make do. And I know other people that had to use literally plastic garbage bags instead of gowns. So as we think through the coordinating things, where's that key point that we need to reach into for production? And it's not just going to be local. We saw that the production of PPE was international, and we had to start to coordinate those resources. We talked about surge capacity. Hospitals started to coordinate beds and open beds and ICUs. We see now the scientific community, as they prepare for vaccines and looking at antivirals, some information is exchanged and things are coordinated. There are, because of dealing with the private sector, some secrets. I get that. But as the vaccine comes out, not only does the scientific community have to deal with testing it and of that, but how does New York City make it available to 8.5 million people? And how do we make it available as a country and globally? So there's a lot of coordination that needs to be looked at, but is integrating the pieces. So let me just, again, stop here for a second. So we did connect, collaborate, and coordinate. Any questions?
I have a question.
Okay, great.
My name is Laura. I don't know. I turned on my video, but it's not showing that you can see me. Oh, well.
Yeah.
You were saying that, oh, there I am. Great. Sometimes it seemed that, especially with COVID, it seems like people didn't understand what level of coordination was necessary. There was sort of an assumption that maybe an individual identity could take, an individual organization could take care of the crisis themselves. They didn't know that they had to then rely on the hospital community and then maybe the state and then maybe, what would you suggest when you're coordinating that is it that you go beyond one level you think is necessary, or how do you approach that thinking so you know that you're organizing as efficiently as possible and you're accessing all the resources that you need to access?
Yeah, Laura, that's a great question and a great challenge. On 9/11, the fire department and the police department, we thought we could do it ourselves. Because we only looked at our world as this just tiny world. And it's the same thing that we're seeing here. The hospitals put a lot of efforts into manage it just themselves. But I think you're right, and your suggestion I like a lot, that it's, let's go one level up. Yes, we need to look 2, 3, 4 levels up, but if I can't get to the first level up, I can't get anywhere. So in a hospital, besides working desperately to look at their staff, who's coming in, do we have beds? Well, the next level up is, let's look at that network, hospital network. Oh, that hospital down the road has more beds. And then if I could look at one level up, well, let's look at 2 levels up. What does public-private look like? Or 3 levels, what does the city look like? And then to the state, and so forth. But your suggestion to start at one level is I think, critical. And that's a great point. Okay, this brings us to command and control. And we love to think command and control is the general standing up, saying, I'm in charge. Well, during Hurricane Sandy, I was teaching a class, and it was a class to a bunch of National Guard generals, 1- and 2-star generals. And in the back of the classroom was the 4-star, the head of the National Guard. And I had 3 stars. So I went, General, I said, I got 3 stars and I worked Hurricane Sandy, and I know you were part of Hurricane Sandy. I said, General, were you in charge? And he came back and said, no, sir, I wasn't. Yes, I'm in charge of the military. Title 32, Title 10, dual status command. I'm in charge, can be in charge of the entire military, but I'm not in charge of first responders. I'm not in charge of the private sector. I'm not in charge of volunteers. So if the general's not in charge and it's not linear, how do we manage, how do we think about managing an event? And I think we think about managing an event as a network where we have different boxes connected to each other. So think of this as a spider web, where we connect to different nodes. So a hospital network we connect to, but we also may connect to a particular hospital. We connect to the mayor's office, and in New York City, the Office of Emergency Management. We connect to the governor's office, and we connect to federal assets. This becomes a network. And I would encourage, as people go through their studies, to ask the question, and I know you go through, and Bill Emick has great management classes on effective management and other classes, but ask, how do we manage in a network world? And I know Bill talks about that, but I don't think we actually teach about managing in a network. We teach this linear thing where somebody's a boss, and we have managers, and then we have workers, and we try to encourage people and so forth. But in a network world where there's many bosses, how do we start to manage that? And I think that's the future as we move past or through this pandemic, and as we enter this new phase for the fall, when we have to deal with the flu and the pandemic at the same time, is the skill sets of networking. And I believe it's those 5 skill sets of connect, collaborate, coordinate, and the command and control in a network world. But within that, it's the ability to communicate on voice, video, and data. It's the ability to negotiate. So if all of us that are on this conference call are in charge of a hospital or a hospital network or supplies, well, and I'm one of the managers of a hospital, I need to not debate you saying, I got a great idea, I need this, this is why I need the ventilators. Yeah, I need to do that, but if it comes in a debate and somebody else needs it too, it's not going to work. So I think our negotiation skills now become critical, that we recognize other people's needs. I need this right now. You don't need that till later. And we saw this happen. Let me have the ventilators now. When I don't need it, I will make sure you get it. And that video conferencing, now that I'm looking you straight in the eye, now it becomes personal. And we need to build trust. If we lose our trust, then we have nothing. And as we've seen, the system will start to crash. So this network world of the 5 C's that I presented, as well as the skill sets of communication and negotiation, really becomes critical. And I will tell you, I believe that is so critical that, and Bill Emick believes, Professor Emick believes so much, that we're offering an executive ed class to both public and private sector on this, which we'll hold in November. So SEPA really believes that these skills that we're talking about now, we have to take time and bring in professors for our leaders in both New York City, state, New Jersey, the metropolitan area. And we may even go further than that since it's all on Zoom. Well, let me stop and see if you have any questions on these principles that we learned from past disasters that we could apply to this disaster, that we could literally apply tomorrow as we go through this pandemic.
Hi, I wanted to, can you hear me?
Yeah, Jennifer.
Oh, hi. I wanted to speak on what you said earlier, almost about like the empathy, like needing to care. When COVID was coming here, or was already here and we didn't know it, one of the things as a Girl Scout leader I was struggling with is other leaders and parents saying, oh, it's just the flu. It's just like the flu. It's not a big deal. And we had all these Girl Scout cookie boot sales that we were managing. And all I kept thinking is, this isn't the flu. And we can't put all those girls out like in the community spread, you know, and I was having a really difficult time because I was up against the data and people not realizing that we were in a crisis, and versus people who felt like we were already in a crisis. And it was really difficult because the leadership from like our Girl Scout Council didn't feel like we were in a crisis. So.
Yeah, I think people love to deny it. Okay, it's not that bad. We could do this because the Girl Scout cookies is critical to the organization. But I think as we start to talk to that leadership and say, you know, that mom or that dad's really worried about their daughter. How are we going to create that safe environment? That more than anything, as we look at Girl Scouts and the foundation, what Girl Scouts stands for, it's safety of young girls on many levels. So I think once we get past the politics and we start to express what people are feeling, and as you mentioned, getting some of the data, and I know the data was real difficult, and even wearing masks in the beginning was not as was a problem. But I think reaching people, listening to not only the top leadership, but telling them what people are feeling. So give you a quick example. I was a chief, bunch of stars on the collar. Sometimes people are afraid, even though I always listen to people, but they're afraid of the rank. But I had an aide who was a firefighter, and his job was to listen to the firefighters, and he would tell me stuff that other people were afraid to tell me. And I think in your position, by listening to the parents and even the girls themselves, is critical to get that up to senior leaders in the organization. So great question. I think somebody else got.
Hi, this is Jenny Alpert. I have a quick question going back to the concept of organizational bias. So I'm just wondering, in these situations, have different networks and organizations, in order to ensure that they're communicating effectively, do they maybe assign formal point people to make sure that they're in contact with one another? Kind of what successes have we seen in these situations?
Yeah. What we've seen, and we've done it in New York, and you mentioned it, having this point person. Okay. So we took a battalion chief and assigned them as his full job as in NYPD, at 1PP, at police headquarters. And we sent the captain to fire department headquarters. And that person was assigned, had their own office. So there's a point of connection. But I would also say there's two other things that happen that we should be aware of. And one is just to introduce ourselves. And Dr. Atul Gawande wrote the book, Checklist Manifesto. He's a doctor from the Boston area. And he said that doctors introducing themselves in the operating room to the nurses gave the nurses permission to speak up. So by us introducing ourselves to above and below allows us to build that relationship to speak up, that gives people permission to speak up. If we don't introduce ourselves as, oh, that guy, he's a big shot, or she's a big shot, I can't speak to them. But no, my name is Joe. Jennifer, it's really nice meeting you. But then I would do something else. And it's what I mentioned before. To overcome organizational bias, we have to use that crisis empathy. That crisis empathy. When we were talking about the Girl Scouts, and just saying to the mom, hey, I know you're afraid that your daughter could contract this disease by selling cookies. I know you're afraid of that, but we're going to take some precautions now. This is what we're going to do. And you see, now we made the connection, and it's personal. The other thing, what we do with hospitals, and certainly what we did with the first responders, as leaders overcome their organizational bias and connect to each other and start to collaborate, it's also sharing the risk. If something goes wrong, we're both going to take the criticism. We're in this together. And I did that with NYPD. I had an incident of active shooter, and I spoke to my counterpart, and there was a fire lieutenant that was shot, and we were able to get him out. But now they're sending in ESU, the SWAT team. And I went up to my counterpart and I said to them, hey, I know this is dangerous. And so I'm doing the crisis empathy. And I know you have your officers inside, but I have my paramedics out here. And if something happens, we're going to go in and we're going to get that officer out. And no matter what, we're doing this together. Even though it was a police incident by me as the fire chief saying we're in this together, we started to break down walls. And it got to the point where police like to use their helicopters and fly to Bellevue Hospital. So a great hospital in New York, one of their officers gets shot. I wound up saying, well, we did that, it would take too long and that officer would die. Let's shut down these roads to the trauma center. And this was in Staten Island. And only because we built trust and we're in it together, that's if something went wrong, I was going to take the brunt of it as well as my counterpart, that we were able to make a safe way, if an officer would have got hurt, to get to the hospital the quickest to save his or her life. So you see these techniques are critical for overcoming bias, organizational bias.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I think we have Sergey has his hand up.
Hello, Professor Pfeiffer again, and thank you so much. I'm really honored to have you, to have a 9/11 first responder talking and answering our questions. I want to ask about your 5 C's principles, but from the international perspective, and I want to compare the 9/11 crisis to what's going on now. I think at that time, these principles worked really well, and international leaders communicated, collaborated, helped each other, and as a result, we saw a really effective counter-terrorist operation where everybody was involved. Every single country was there, and there was trust. Now that part is missing, and we need it so much because it will. Imagine if countries, especially big players, can work together on a vaccine. Now we would be in a totally different situation. What's your opinion about that? I know it's a little bit all over the place, but maybe you can say something about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I think it's extremely important that countries work together. And certainly the big countries that have resources. But if we're going to beat a pandemic, we need to work with the smaller countries that don't have those resources. The reason why we stopped Ebola, and I was very close to the stuff we were doing in New York with that, but spoke to international groups that we took care of it in Western Africa. And we need to start to apply those 5 C's internationally. I actually have an email from one of my friends with the UN that has gone to disasters and one of the most experienced people around, which I have to get back to. But we need to start to build that. Everything we talked about here, sharing information, collaborating in Zoom conferences like we're doing here, coordinating those resources internationally and building our networks. The UN has their own system, their cluster system. The US has national incident management system. Well, those are good, but they're part of that network, that web point. Yeah, clusters are just an element. Incident management is just an element. So hospitals will do incident management. And I know hospitals, I've done it, I've spoken to them. They need to organize. And then as we look at clusters, and we've talked about it, vaccines, PPE, tracking, tracing, I think the more we're able to share and make things transparent. So maps are wonderful. And we see these hotspots, but hotspots are the responsibility. How do we make it less, those hotspots? It's not saying, hey, we're good in New York now. Yeah, we have a little bad in the beginning. We're good now. The south part of the country, you're on your own. Well, no, because that's what's happened initially, and it didn't work. we all need to be able to work this through. So I think as we move forward, we're going to see more and more international collaboration, and I don't think we're going to have a choice. And certainly the UN is seated in the right spot because they've done earthquakes and tsunamis. It's just getting the richer countries to now to share the resources.
I have a question, if that's
Sure.
all right. In terms of you know, how we differentiate between 9/11 and coronavirus, in the sense that we have 9/11 is, you know, located in one spot. It affected a small community compared to coronavirus, whereas everyone's facing coronavirus at the same time. I think when we're applying the 5 C's, they did work obviously well with that localized situation where everyone's coming together to focus on one situation. When everyone's fending for themselves, how do you overcome that? Because I'm thinking about, you know, in Europe, that's supposed to be the EU, you're supposed to be working together. You have some states, some countries blocking PPE from being delivered to other countries, or, you know, that kind of thing that we saw with the ventilators in the States. And now with, you know, the South being kind of, well, left to their own devices while the North is recovering. How do we respond to that when everyone's facing the same thing?
Yeah. Great question, and a great challenge. Certainly 9/11, we could apply it because we could wrap our heads around it. Now, it wasn't that easy when I was standing there at the moment and the days and the months afterwards. I think the same principles apply, but we need to start to expand it out. And realizing, as we did with terrorism, that it's a global event. Well, the pandemic is global, and really pushing us to our limit. So I think as we see countries reach out to each other, so sometimes it only takes 1 or 2 countries to do that, to start it. Think about it, and I know this is a bad analogy, but just wearing the mask, it just took a few people to start that, and then we saw it become almost normal. Now, yes, I know there's conflicts, and we could talk about that forever. But as countries start to work with each other, especially in the EU, when they're so dependent on each other, that can start a trend. And the same principles apply, but it's being done at a wider area. The network is bigger. And maybe it is to start to look at the UN and their system and start to leverage that. You know, you think of some of the tsunamis that we've dealt with over the years, and how they were huge events. So I think we're going to see those principles applied, but it's going to take effort on a federal or national level.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, I don't have an easy answer to that.
No, I mean, yeah.
I feel your frustration, and as I was speaking, I felt the same frustration.
Well, we have a few minutes left. If anyone has it.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you for your lecture today, Professor. I'm just wondering, do you think China in this pandemic is a special case because China is so centralized government? So actually, I think government plays a very important role in this pandemic, in the whole process, and the whole policy and management procedure is enforced from the top to the bottom across the whole nation. And I think this is very unique in the whole world because all the other countries are not that centralized as China. What do you think? What's your opinion?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought up the China example. And I've been back and forth teaching in China at least a half a dozen times. I've lost track. It really helped my frequent flyer miles. And I've taught deputy mayors, so not just students, but also deputy mayors. But the central authority in China is able to move more quickly. And certainly we saw that. But don't be fooled. It took local government, even though they're getting word from the top, but local government and doctors to start to come together. You could get an order from the top, but then it starts to organize from the bottom. So we're seeing what I saw with China was two things coming from the top, which gives a sense of urgency. You need to do this now, and then starting to self-organize on the bottom that went in the direction of the leaders of the top. And we don't see that. When I was teaching in China, I was actually teaching about our incident management system, and the deputy mayors didn't want to talk in class, and we brought some professors over, and professors who die to be in the class, these super professors and there was nobody raising the hand in class. And then I said to the deputy mayors, I said, if we can't figure this out, and we're working a scenario, if we can't figure this out, every one of us should be fired. And in China, fired, it means like fired for life. And I think that's what happened. From the top, they said, we have to figure this out. But it was at the bottom where different deputy mayors, different hospitals said, oh, if we can't figure this out, we're going to be fired for life. Plus they saw people dying, and they said, well, we have to do this for our city, for our province, for our country. So I think, to answer your question, it was this dual responsibility. It wasn't just from the top. It had to also come from the bottom.
Thank you, Professor.
And I think I'm running out of time, or one more question maybe, and because I have one final slide for you.
If you have time for one more question, I would
Absolutely.
Like. Yeah. You've touched on how to build trust throughout the presentation, but I was wondering if you had, let's say there's a different or a new challenge that has maybe new players and you have to act quickly. Are there trusted methods that you use to build trust quickly, maybe beyond empathy or beyond data collection? Is there a little formula that you use, or is there something that would allow you to have everyone on the same page in the same room and then start working towards a solution as quickly as possible?
Yeah. If it wasn't for COVID, my secret formula for that, for other things than a pandemic, a biological event, is location, location, location. Putting people in proximity to each other. So with the cops and firefighters and paramedics, if we're standing across the street from each other, we're not going to work together. If we're standing next to each other, we're going to work together. So we wrote a protocol that was adopted by New York City that in a major incident, we have to stand literally within arm's distance of each other. But that doesn't work for a pandemic. So the challenge is, can we bring people together that it feels like we're in the same location? And I think we're going to have to experiment with that. And I know Bill Emick is experimenting with that. Instead of 60 people coming together in a class, only 15 are going to come together. I think we could experiment with Zoom. Instead of 100 people on Zoom, maybe a half a dozen people. So how do we create a location where people feel responsible to each other? And we get to experiment with that in real time. So, a great question. But let me leave you one more slide, and I'm gonna see if I could do this quickly. And I'm gonna actually skip a slide. Okay, I had to slip that slide. We didn't have enough time, but it was a slide on resiliency, but I will be talking next week to the hospitals about that. And I'm sure if they tape it, I'll make it available to Bill. But as we look at these events that really rock us to our core, I just want to leave you with one final quote. And that's that the heart of crisis leadership is the ability to sustain hope by unifying efforts to solve complex problems in the face of great tragedy. And I think that's what we're about now. We have to sustain hope because we're all afraid and we're not sure where we're going. And the way we sustain hope is by bringing people together, bringing our efforts together to solve these complex problems. And we do that in real time in the face of this great tragedy that affects all of us. And I believe this is really the definition of crisis leadership, and that all of us are called to lead during this time, whether it's the Girl Scouts, whether it's hospitals, whether it's the UN, whether it's countries and states and provinces. We're all called to give a sense of hope and to collectively come together to solve these problems. So I wish you all the best, to stay safe, and that we're in this together. Thank you, everybody.